They told you Dubai was different. They told you this was the city that had cracked the code, the place where the old rules of economics did not apply, where ambition was enough of a foundation, and where the desert itself had been convinced to cooperate. And for a long time, looking at the skyline, looking at the passenger numbers, looking at the property valuations and the Forbes lists, and the Instagram grids of people who had decided this was the center of their universe, it was almost possible to believe them. Almost, because something shifted in the early months of 2026. Quietly at first, then loudly, then in the kind of way that becomes impossible to explain away with a press release or a rebranding campaign. The streets that were supposed to be permanently electric with the energy of the world's most ambitious city started to feel different. The airports that were supposed to be the proof that every road led here started to look different. And the numbers that had always been Dubai's most powerful argument, started telling a story that nobody in a position of authority wanted to be the one to read aloud. Ghost streets, empty airports, hotel lobbies, immaculate and silent. A city that was built to be the loudest thing on earth, going quieter than anyone thought possible. So the question sitting at the center of all of this, the one that serious people are now asking in very serious rooms, is whether what we are watching is a correction or a conclusion, whether Dubai is stumbling through a difficult chapter or whether the chapter itself is the problem. We are going to go through every layer of it today. The airports, the hotels, the streets, the labor camps, the legal architecture, the economic model underneath all of it. Because if you want to understand what is actually happening here, you cannot start at the surface. You have to go all the way down. Let us start at the airport, because that is where the signal first became impossible to ignore. Dubai International was not merely a piece of infrastructure. It was a philosophy rendered in steel and glass, a physical argument that this city was the hinge point of the entire world, the place where East met West and where the money flowing between them naturally stopped to rest. The numbers that DXB produced were extraordinary. 95 million passengers moving through its terminals in 2025 alone. Route maps that stretched to every corner of the planet. A departure board that read like a directory of human ambition. And then the cancellations started. Not a handful. Not the kind of disruption you chalk up to weather or a technical fault somewhere in the system. According to Syria, more than 37,000 flights were removed from the boards in the first 3 weeks of March 2026. Western carriers suspending their routes one after another, with statements that were almost identical in their language and completely identical in their reasoning. The cost of risk insurance for operating in and out of Dubai had risen so sharply, so suddenly, that the commercial mathematics simply stopped working. British Airways made the call, Cathay Pacific made the call, Air Canada made the call. When airlines make that calculation, when the companies that built their entire business model on connecting the world to a specific city look at the numbers and decide the connection is no longer worth making on current terms, you are not looking at a temporary inconvenience. You are looking at a verdict. Dubai airports later confirmed that first quarter passenger traffic was down by at least 2.5 million from the same period in 2025. March specifically recorded a 66% year-on-year drop in passenger numbers, the single worst monthly figure since the depths of the pandemic. The airport that was engineered to receive the world was running at a fraction of its designed capacity for the most critical weeks of its peak season. And unlike a weather disruption or a technical failure, the cause was not something that could be fixed by a maintenance crew or a forecast update. It was a judgment being rendered on the region by the global aviation industry simultaneously. And that judgment does not reset the moment a ceasefire is announced. It resets on a longer, slower schedule driven by lived experience and rebuilt confidence, not by diplomatic communiques. The terminals were not empty in the way an abandoned building is empty. People were still moving through those halls. But pay attention to the direction of that movement and what those people were carrying. These were not investors arriving with capital and ambition packed into their carry-ons. These were not tourists with restaurant reservations and hotel confirmations. These were people trying to leave. The energy had reversed completely. The airport that was built to receive the world was being used as an exit, and the most visceral physical evidence of that reversal was sitting in the long-stay car parks, gathering sand. Dubai's criminal debt laws have always created a specific and unusual pressure on people facing financial difficulty here, a pressure that manifests year after year in the form of luxury vehicles abandoned across parking structures. Between 2,000 and 3,000 cars are abandoned in Dubai every single year, a chronic and documented feature of what happens when a city with criminal debt statutes meets a large, transient, credit-exposed expatriate population. Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Bentleys, cars worth anywhere between $100,000 and several $100,000, keys still in them in some cases. Because when the legal exposure of staying outweighs the financial value of what you are leaving behind, the calculation becomes very simple. The machine stays. The person runs for the gate, from the airports to the hotels, and the story does not lighten. It acquires a specificity that makes it harder to look away from, because the Dubai hospitality industry was never simply in the business of providing accommodation. It was in the business of providing proof that the dream was real, that unlimited money, when properly applied to marble and water features and staff ratios that border on the theatrical, produced something worth crossing the world for. That proof drove occupancy rates that hotels in other cities could only read about with envy. As recently as February 2026, Dubai hotels were running at 84.7% occupancy, according to CoStar data. And then the early weeks of March arrived, and those rates did not dip, they collapsed. CoStar recorded Dubai hotel occupancy falling to 36.2% in March, compared with 71.4% in the same month the previous year. The weekly low, recorded in the week ending March 14th, was 22.8%, the market's worst performance since April 2020. At the absolute depth of the pandemic. Moody's Analytics published a forecast in early May, projecting occupancy could fall further to around 10% for Q2 as a whole. Their words, not ours. This represents an effective shutdown of large parts of the hospitality sector. A return to pre-conflict conditions, Moody's added, is unlikely before early 2027. The five-star towers stood fully staffed and almost entirely silent. Restaurants with painstakingly developed concepts and wine lists that represented years of curation served almost no one. Lobby staff stood at their stations in immaculate uniforms with nothing to do and nowhere to direct the guests who were not arriving. The Jumeirah Marsa Al Arab, one of the most anticipated luxury openings in the city's recent memory, found itself trading in this environment. And the Burj Al Arab, the sail-shaped icon that had for years been the visual shorthand for everything Dubai claimed to represent, closed its doors for 18 months of renovation. The Jumeirah Group CEO framed it publicly as an opportunity, fast-tracking renovation work, doing in 1 year what would normally take 3. That is rational asset management. It is also the acknowledgement, dressed in the language of opportunity, that the guests who would fill those rooms at full rate had decided to be somewhere else. The response from the properties that remained open was telling in its own way. Hotels across Palm Jumeirah and the Jumeirah Strip that had once operated a strict no-discount policy, because in the luxury segment discounting damages brand perception in ways that take years to repair, began offering resident packages at reductions of between 30 and 50% on their published rates. 5 Palm Jumeirah selling stay and dine packages for under $100 a person. Rooms that typically start above 1,000 dirhams a night going for a fraction of that. Not because the hotels wanted to extend that access, because the alternative was running those rooms empty, and the operational mathematics of running a 100-floor luxury property at 15 to 20% occupancy in 40-degree desert heat with full staffing, full climate control, full service infrastructure, and the legal compliance obligations of one of the world's most regulated hospitality environments does not produce a sustainable financial outcome. It produces a runway, and runways are finite. One operator told AGBI they had enough cash to survive 2 to 3 months at those occupancy levels. Maximum, before the situation required either a recovery in international demand or a fundamental rethinking of what the business was doing. If you are finding this useful, now is a good time to hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because what comes next, the streets, the legal system, and the structural question underneath all of it is where this story gets most revealing. Out on the streets of the city itself, the story shifts from spectacular to something quieter and considerably more revealing. Because the truest signal that a city is under genuine pressure is not what is happening in its airport terminals or its hotel lobbies. It is what the people are doing, and what the people of Dubai were doing in the opening months of 2026 was reassessing. The resident population, which had been growing at close to 4% annually through 2025, slowed to approximately 1% growth in 2026. That sounds modest on paper. In a city of 4 million people where 90% of the population is expatriate, where every resident is making a continuous calculation about whether the opportunity here justifies the cost and the compromise and the absence of any permanent legal stake in the place, a deceleration of that magnitude carries real economic weight. The restaurants they were not filling, the school places they were not taking, the apartments they were not signing leases on, the car leases, the personal trainers, the dry cleaners, the Tuesday evening dinners, the 100 small transactions that quietly power every functioning urban economy and never appear in a sovereign wealth fund announcement. When that layer of economic activity decelerates, The things above it feel the absence faster than most financial models anticipate. The data from the property market captures the situation with a precision that the more dramatic narratives tend to flatten. Property transaction volumes in Q1 2026 moderated 17% quarter-on-quarter from the record highs of Q4 2025, though they remained up 19% year-on-year. Not the floor falling out scenario the headlines sometimes imply, but a clear deceleration from an extraordinary pace. The more significant movement came in ready property transactions and the off-plan secondary market. Ready transactions fell 35% in March and 46% in April, compared with the same months in 2025. The off-plan secondary market, where investors hold contracts on unbuilt apartments and resell them before completion, saw values decline approximately 9% in Q1 2026. Overall residential prices came down 4 to 7% from their January peak. New apartment rental contracts, which had hit a median of 78,000 dirhams per year in February, fell to 70,000 dirhams by April, a 10% drop in 2 months. None of these figures describe a 2008-style collapse. Fitch had already forecast a 10 to 15% correction in certain segments before the conflict began on the basis of supply and demand dynamics alone. What the conflict added was a sentiment shock on top of a market that was already entering a more cautious phase after the most extraordinary boom in its history. The combination is significant, but it is important to be precise about what the data shows and what it does not. The listed developer equity story is considerably more dramatic than the physical property transaction story, and it is worth understanding why they differ. The DFM Real Estate Index, which tracks publicly listed developers like MR and Aldar, fell approximately 21% in the 2 weeks following the February 28th strikes. The exchange itself was closed by regulators for 2 full trading days. That index is a measure of investor sentiment about the future performance of development companies. It can move in seconds. Physical property prices move on months of transactions. The gap between a 21% equity index drop and a 4 to 7% physical price decline is not a contradiction. It is what a sentiment shock looks like before the sentiment either deepens into a structural reality or stabilizes and partially reverses. Which of those paths Dubai's property market takes depends almost entirely on how long the geopolitical disruption runs and whether international buyers return in sufficient numbers to absorb the supply pipeline that was already enormous before any of this began. Now move below all of this, below the hotels and the runways and the quieter streets and the recalibrating property market. Move into the part of Dubai that the promotional materials have always worked carefully to keep peripheral. The labor districts, Al Quoz, Sonapur, the industrial zones that sit on the far side of what gets photographed and filtered and posted, because the human cost of what is happening in 2026 is not being distributed evenly. It never is. The workforce that built this city in the literal sense, that mixed the concrete and welded the steel and laid the cabling and finished the interiors of every tower that became an icon, represents close to 90% of the actual labor force of the UAE. They earn on average between $300 and $500 per month in a city where a single evening at one of the towers they built can cost more than that across a table for 2. Their presence in the country is governed by the kafala system, which ties visa status directly to an employer. When that employer faces cash flow pressure because the hospitality groups they supply have seen revenue collapse, or because the construction projects they work on have paused pending the return of investor confidence, the consequences for the workers are not proportional to the consequences for the business. They are categorical. Human Rights Watch documented extensively between 2023 and 2025 that Gulf states have been slow to implement heat protection measures adequate to prevent occupational death and chronic kidney failure among outdoor workers. The crisis of 2026 layered financial precarity onto a system already operating without sufficient safety margins for the people at its foundation. The remittance flows from the labor accommodation zones, the monthly transfers to families in Kerala and Dhaka and Cebu that represent in many cases the arithmetic difference between subsistence and genuine poverty, were disrupted when the money simply was not there to send. That reality sits at the base of everything happening here, and it is the dimension of this story that deserves the most sustained attention rather than the most consistent omission. Step back from the individual layers and look at the legal architecture, because there is a dimension to financial distress in Dubai that transforms what would elsewhere be a difficult business environment into something considerably more serious. The city marketed its legal system for years as a feature of the product: clean, efficient, predictable, a system that protected your wealth and honored your transactions and moved with the speed that serious capital required. What the marketing was careful not to emphasize is that the same legal architecture that worked elegantly on the way up has a very specific character on the way down. A defaulted loan does not initiate a managed restructuring conversation. It can initiate an arrest warrant, an exit ban, issued quietly and enforced with the efficiency the system was always designed to operate at. The tax residency dimension compounds the exposure from the other direction. Individuals who had relocated to Dubai specifically to establish their tax residency, who had structured their financial lives around the regulatory advantages the UAE offered, found themselves squeezed from both directions simultaneously. Stay and navigate the systemic disruption at close range, or leave and potentially activate the residency rules in the jurisdictions they had spent considerable resources and professional attention to exit cleanly. There was no clean option. Only a managed retreat negotiated one uncomfortable conversation at a time, with professionals who were now explaining very carefully that frictionless exits were no longer the product being offered. The dream of perfectly mobile capital had acquired, very suddenly, a significant amount of friction. What makes all of this so structurally significant? What lifts this conversation beyond the level of a bad financial quarter or a correcting real estate market is the question it forces Dubai to confront about what actually sits at the center of its economy when you remove all the layers that were designed to impress. Strip away the tax incentives and the residency packages and the record-breaking tourism statistics. Strip away the towers and the manufactured coastline and the hotels with names that read like a challenge to physics. What is the economic core? What does this city produce that gives it genuine gravity? What does it make or grow or originate that would keep capital here if the capital decided tomorrow that the risk calculation had shifted? The honest answer to that question is the uncomfortable center of everything happening here. Dubai became world-class at attracting capital and circulating capital and converting capital into spectacle. But circulation is not production. Spectacle is not a foundation. When the global environment shifted on February 28th, when the geopolitical calculation that had made Dubai feel like the safest available option for the world's most mobile wealth changed in a single evening, the city encountered a structural question it had successfully avoided during the years when the numbers were too good to allow serious interrogation. The loyalty of internationally mobile capital to a place is not personal. It is not sentimental. It is conditional. It is a calculation that gets run continuously and gets updated every time the variables change. And when enough variables change simultaneously in early 2026, that calculation returned a different result across enough portfolios and enough boardrooms that the cumulative effect became what we are observing now, not the end of Dubai. The evidence does not support that conclusion. The airport is recovering. Hotels are adapting. The property market has softened but not broken. The UAE government has shown consistently that it has both the resources and the institutional will to intervene when intervention is required, and the relief packages and grace periods issued in March and April of this year reflect exactly that capacity. But a recovery in occupancy rates is not the same thing as a recovery in the foundational confidence that made those occupancy rates possible, and those are two very different rebuilding projects. The Dubai story was a genuinely remarkable thing. While it functioned at full capacity, it managed to convince some of the most analytically rigorous financial minds in the world that a city could substitute ambition and regulatory design for the deeper foundations that cities throughout history have required to sustain themselves through serious disruption. It convinced developers and governments and individuals to commit capital at a scale that most ideas, however well executed, never achieve. And for an extended period, it worked. The idea had enough momentum and enough early success to validate itself continuously. But ideas built on the promise of perpetual insulation from the world that surrounds them eventually face the moment when that promise gets tested. That moment was February 28th. What remains now, beneath the recovering terminals and the discounted lobbies and the quieter boulevards, is a question that no sovereign wealth fund can entirely answer, and no regulatory reform can fully bypass. It is the question of what a place actually needs to be underneath everything it chose to appear to be. Whether the architecture of ambition can outlast the disruption that tested it. Whether a city that optimized almost everything for the continuous arrival of international capital and international visitors can find a different footing when that arrival pauses. And whether the recovery that is now measurably underway will return things to exactly where they were on February 27th, the last normal day, or to somewhere different, built on a slightly more honest accounting of what this city has always needed to function. What do you think is on the other side of this? Is there a version of Dubai that comes back on a more durable footing? Or does the model itself contain the answer? And what we are watching is the model being forced to reckon with itself for the first time. Drop your thoughts in the comments. This is a conversation that deserves more than a single perspective. If this kind of analysis matters to you, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the movements happening across the global economy right now are not slowing down, and the next investigation is already in progress.